to be attached to a bone. So if it comes in contact with a bone, we're going to refer to it as being a skeletal muscle. Now, the one thing about your skeletal muscles is that you guys get to have control of these. You dictate when and how they move. And so that is a communication from your brain through your nervous system, telling these muscles what you need them to do and when you need them to do it. With the cardiac muscle, that's a little bit different. The cardiac muscle, as I already mentioned, already found or only found in the heart, and it has to be designed in a very special way because the heart muscle is going to work for you every day of your life. Hopefully that is 80, 90 plus years, and every day of your life that heart has to beat continuously. So it has to behave and work a little bit different than your other muscles, because if you think of your skeletal muscles, all of us have had those Charlie horses or growing pains that you get at various times throughout your life where those muscles cramp, and you can't have your heart muscle do that same thing. So they get a special design to ensure that they don't go through the same problems or issues that our skeletal muscles go through. And so that's why we see that cardiac muscle only in the heart, to ensure that it's able to work and function for us every second of our lives without having any problems. The third class is the smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is going to be found in those places where we don't have to think about them working for us. The brain is automatically going to take over control of our smooth muscle. So if you think of those body parts that have a muscular job to carry out, but we don't have to worry about it, for example, your stomach. You guys put food into your stomach, and the stomach is going to contract and mash and roll over that food and go through all the parts of digestion. You don't have to sit there and tell your stomach what you need it to do. It will just simply do that, and that is because it is under automatic control through your brain. Likewise, in your blood vessels, you have a muscle layer within the blood vessels that will constrict when you need those blood vessels to become smaller, or relax when you need those blood vessels to become larger, depending on what's going on within the body. So any of those places where you can think of that work and do their job and you don't have to worry about it, you can pretty much guarantee that they are going to have smooth muscle. So in those internal organs, your blood vessels, your lymphatic vessels, those would be the types of places that you would see that smooth muscle. Now, when you look at some of the characteristics that are associated with the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, under both of them, it talks about being striated. Striated is something that you guys have seen. You've seen it several different times. We just typically don't put that term striation to it. If you guys will visualize what a zebra looks like, you guys have seen striations. Striations is a very fancy way to indicate that you have a banding pattern of alternating light and dark bands. So if you think of a zebra, you have the white bands alternating with the black bands, and they're just simply lined up side by side. That is what a striation is. In the case of our body, when we talk about striations, we are referencing that particular design within the muscle tissue itself. So if you've ever seen a slide image of muscle tissue, if you can see a light and dark alternating pattern, that tells you right off the bat that you are either looking at skeletal muscle or you are looking at cardiac muscle. If you don't see that banding pattern, don't see that appearance whatsoever, that immediately tells you that you are looking at smooth muscle. It lacks that alternating light and dark coloration and has a more random design with the cells of smooth muscle, and so that's why you don't see those striations there. So if you ever are looking at histology slides and you see those striations, you can immediately eliminate smooth muscle as an option, but if you see those, then you know that you at least are at skeletal or cardiac. Now, once you identify it as being skeletal or cardiac, there has to be another way to determine if you're actually looking at the skeletal muscle or if you're looking at cardiac. And that's going to be by a structure that is known as an intercalated disc. The only place that you will find intercalated discs in the muscle tissue is going to be in your cardiac muscle. Now, what the intercalated disc is, it's a very thick band, and it is between two cells of the cardiac muscle. So where one cell ends, you'll have this very thick, dark strip, and then the next cell will start. And they are dark enough that you can actually see them on the microscope slide. They are much thicker and bolder than the striations, so it is still easy to distinguish them from the striations themselves. And what those intercalated discs are is they are a connection that you have between the cells of your heart muscle that ensures when those heart cells contract, they all contract. In your skeletal muscle, when a contraction happens, it is a domino-like effect where one part of the muscle gets that first impulse to contract, it sends it over to the neighbor, which will contract, then the next one, just like a domino, you hit that first one, it has to knock over the second one and on down the line until they all fall over. That's essentially how your contraction in the skeletal muscle takes place. You can't have that in the cardiac muscle. When the cardiac muscle contracts, the whole goal is to get your blood all moving in the same direction and get it moving forward. And when you're talking about that blood that is all the way down in the tips of your toes, that contraction has to happen with enough force to push that blood from your toes and get it moving back up towards your heart. So it takes a lot of force and a coordinated effort to make sure that that can happen. So those intercalated discs just make sure that we don't see that domino-like effect, which would not generate enough force to get that blood moving where it needs to go. They connect those cells so that when one goes, they all go together. And that is going to give you the strength that you need behind that heart contraction to get that blood all moving in the right direction. The second slide that you have talks about the major parts of the muscle. And with the design of the skeletal muscle, you have, and most people are very familiar, if you say muscle, people can kind of envision what that looks like. But there are a lot of components that are going to be part of the human muscle in order to allow it to be able to do everything that it needs to do. So you have nervous tissue. The skeletal muscles are going to get their information that they need to contract through nerves. And a lot of times this is just simply referred to as the neuromuscular junction. It is the point where a nerve comes right up against the muscle tissue or very close to the muscle tissue, so that when the stimulus comes in for that muscle to contract, they are in close enough proximity that that information can be relayed over to the muscle that the contraction process needs to happen. So nerves are very important in our skeletal muscles and how they work, because that is how they are going to get the information that a contraction needs to be carried out. Blood is also going to be a very big component in our muscles, because when our muscles contract, it takes a lot of energy in order for that to happen. And it's been a long time since we talked about ATP formation. That's all the way back in chapter 2, which was pretty much our second week of class. But we talked about the fact that your cells are going to be responsible for making ATP, which is the fuel source for our cells. And the big driving force behind the process of being able to make ATP is the presence of oxygen. How do we get oxygen delivered to our cells? It is brought to the cells through our blood. So making sure that our muscles have a very good blood supply is essential to how they work and are able to continue to do their job. Because especially when we start pushing our muscles and we ask them to work over an extended period of time, they are using ATP. They're also having to rebuild and replace that ATP to make sure that they can continue to work. So that blood flow to those muscles, constantly bringing that oxygen in, is how they are able to make sure that they always have that ATP on hand to continue to do their work. Now, the next one under blood talks about connective tissues. Connective tissues are another very important part of the muscle itself, because when we talk about muscles, most people think of a very large mass of tissue all working together. But muscles are designed in a way that you have one single strand, and then those strands are going to get bundled together. And what bundles those together is a layer of connective tissue. And then you're going to have another group of strands, and they are all going to get bundled together, which is going to be another type of connective tissue that is going to hold all of those together. And then you kind of keep building that up and you keep bundling those with layers of connective tissue to hold it all together until you get to the muscle as a whole. Again, if you are more on the visual side of learning, think about a braid. Even if you've never done a braid on somebody's hair or had one done in your hair, if you think about somebody's hair down just loose, you have all those individual strands of hair, and that's essentially how your muscle is. And then if you're going to do a braid, you are going to take all of those individual strands and you initially will bundle them into 3 groups. And then you are going to weave those 3 bundles of hair together to get the braid as a whole. So we went from having all the individual strands of hair just all loose and going every which way to bundling them into 3 groups and then essentially weaving that all together to get one final product. And that is how the muscle is put together as well. It's the job of those connective tissues to bundle all of those layers and bring them together as one functioning unit. Then we have the fascia. The fascia is going to be the outermost layer of connective tissue. So it is going to be the one that is over all the bundles and holds everything together to get to that working muscle as a whole. Tendons are very important. And the big thing about tendons is a lot of times people will use the term tendon and ligament in place of each other, and you can't. They are 2 different structures, they do 2 different things. A tendon is going to be connected to a bone and a muscle. So it is going to help anchor the muscle in place. And when you track a tendon back, one side of it is going to be attached to the muscle tissue and the other side is going to be attached to the bone. Now, one thing about your tendons, if you think about the sheer amount of force you guys place on your muscles when you do any sort of activity, walking is not considered to be really high impact, but you're carrying all of your body weight in doing that. When you run, obviously you are upping the amount of impact, and now you are putting even more demand on those tendons because they have to hold those muscles in place. If they tear free, that muscle doesn't have anything to pull against, and now you're not going to be able to carry out movement. So what happens is in our discussion over bones, we talked about the periosteum. That was that skin-like covering over the surface of the bones. And while we talked about what it did in reference to the bone, I didn't connect it to the muscles quite yet. That periosteum actually is going to grow into a tendon. So wherever you need that connection from muscle to bone, it's actually going to originate right out of that periosteum. The reason that that's so important is because if you think like a magnet on your fridge, and if you stick a magnet to your fridge, that'll stick and hold, but it's not a strong attachment. But if you think about 2 things that are actually fused together and how much stronger that is, that's essentially what we have with the tendon and the periosteum. They're not just stuck to each other, but they actually are fused to each other. And that gives it a much stronger link to make sure that those muscles are held in place, even when you put a large amount of demand or force on them. And then the last one that we have on there is the aponeuroses. The aponeuroses is going to be a term that indicates a very large sheet of tendon. And we have these in multiple places. You'll notice that it points out one on the top of the head. So from the frontalis muscle, which makes up the forehead, to the occipitalis, which is going to be on the back of the head, between those 2, running right over the top of the skull, you are going to have an aponeuroses. Likewise, you have one that runs down the abdomen. It points that out on your picture as well. These are places where you need to have a little bit extra strength and connection between muscles, especially in the abdominal region because of the support. Not having bone structure in there, that aponeuroses just helps those muscles hold their place and carry out all the things that they need to do for the body. So an aponeuroses is a tendon, but it is a much larger, broader sheet of tendon than what we typically see with the average muscle. From there, it talks about the layers of muscle, and this is where we're going to start to see those connective tissues. So I'm going to work from the small end up to the big end. So when we look at this particular image, I had indicated earlier that your muscles are actually these individual strands and that we are going to build them up and get to the muscle as a whole from those individual strands. And this picture does a great job of showing you how that construction happens. So the three that you have at the top, the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium, those three are connective tissues. So I referenced those in the last slide. Those are going to be those layers of tissue that are going to bundle around and surround the individual strands to build bigger parts of the muscle. So if you look at the picture, starting with the filaments, it talks about thin and thick filaments. It points two out. One is blue, one is kind of a purplish color. Now, what those filaments are is they are going to be strands of protein, and one is known as myosin and one is known as actin, and that's in your information off to the left-hand side. So you can see the picture of it on the right-hand side, points out the filaments to you, and then the spelling of those two proteins is over on the left-hand side. So actin and myosin. Now, it references actin and myosin as being thick and thin. Actin is going to be the thin protein. Myosin is going to be the thick protein. Now, if we take that back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, I brought up striations and told you guys that striations are going to be an alternating pattern of light and dark bands. And now we're actually putting a name to those. The light colored bands are actin. The dark colored bands are going to be myosin. And because of the thin actin, that appears lighter in color. The myosin being thicker is going to appear dark in color. And they alternate back and forth with each other through the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. And because of that, we get that striated appearance within the muscle tissue. So the very small strands that we have there, those are our actin and our myosin proteins. Now, when we take a bunch of those actin and myosin and we put those all together and bundle those, that is going to create what is known as a myofibril. Now, myo is going to be a prefix that is associated with muscles. So whenever you see that MYO prefix, that is going to indicate to you that you are talking about something associated with the muscle. So we bundle the actin and myosin, we get to that myofibril, and now we're going to continue the process. And we're going to take a bunch of those myofibrils and we're going to bundle those together. Once you package a bunch of myofibrils together, that is going to get us to the muscle fiber, aka a muscle cell. And you can use those two terms in place of each other. If you like fiber better, that's fine. If you like muscle cell better, that is fine. I will understand what you are talking about no matter what term you go with. So filaments are bundled to make a myofibril. Myofibrils are bundled. That gets us to our cell level. And then we're going to take a bunch of those muscle cells and we're going to bundle those together. And that's going to get us to what is known as a fascicle. And about halfway up the picture, you'll see a bracket around all of those myofibrils or those muscle cells that have been packaged together. And that is that fascicle level. Once we take a bunch of fascicles and we bundle all of those, that gets us to the muscle. And then you'll notice the muscle is encased in the fascia. And then the tendon will link that muscle to the bone itself. So very much a process of taking individual pieces, bundling them together, and in bundling them together, getting to that entire muscle as a whole. Now, we haven't talked about the connective tissue coverings, and there are three of them that we need to focus on. Okay. Now, the epimysium, because of that prefix EPI, that is going to indicate to you that it is the outermost or covers kind of everything else. So the epimysium is going to be the layer of connective tissue that we have around the muscle as a whole. So it's underneath the fascia, but it is going to cover the muscle tissue. The perimysium, that is going to be wrapped around the fascicles. So those are going to be tucked underneath the epimysium. And that is going to be the layer of connective tissue that is going to bind those fascicles together. And then if we go down from there, we have the endomysium, and that is going to be the layer that is going to wrap around those muscle fibers or those muscle cells and hold all of those together. So the fascia covers absolutely everything. Epimysium is underneath that, holding the muscle together. Perimysium is underneath that, holding the fascicles together. And the endomysium is underneath that, holding the muscle cells together. All right, just checking on my time very quickly so I don't go over. I do want to get into the next part, and that will kind of be a good place to stop because that will get us through all the parts of the muscle and leave the actual muscle contraction for our second discussion. So looking at the slide that talks about the parts of the muscle, a lot of these are very similar to the parts we have in an average body cell, but they are given slightly different terms just to indicate that they are within a muscle cell. The other thing is we do have a couple that are brand new because a muscle cell has to work very different from your average body cell. So some of them are overlapped from what we've already talked about, just slightly different names to indicate that they are within a muscle. And then a couple of them, as I said, are going to be brand new. So if we look at the sarcolemma, sarcolemma is the cell membrane. Do the exact same thing as the cell membrane. They are going to wrap around the entire cell. They hold everything together and just create a barrier between the cell and the outside. So when you see sarcolemma, sarco is another prefix that is going to indicate muscle, but sarcolemma is referring to the cell membrane of a muscle cell. Sarcoplasm, that again, we see that sarco indicating muscle. Plasm, this is going to be the equivalent of cytoplasm. So just like in our body cells, you had cytoplasm that was going to fill all the extra space not taken up by organelles, helping the cell to maintain its shape, but also move some materials through the cell. That is what the sarcoplasm is going to do within this muscle cell as well. So sarcoplasm is the equivalent of cytoplasm. Then we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the equivalent of the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, when we talked about the endoplasmic reticulum in the body cell, the one thing that I indicated to you guys is to think of it as being hallways. When you guys are moving through a building, as you leave one room and go somewhere else in the building, it's going to be the hallways that are going to channel you and direct you to the next destination within the building. And that's what the sarcoplasmic reticulum does. It is a series of channels that act very much like hallways that are going to direct and maneuver material through the cell so they get to where they're supposed to go. Transverse tubules. Transverse tubules are, if you look at the picture, sandwiched in between the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, with the sarcoplasmic reticulum, if you look at it, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to run across the cell. The transverse tubules are going to dive down into the muscle tissue. Now, on either side of the transverse tubule, you have something that are called the cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And what those actually do is they hold calcium. And that's going to be very important for our next discussion. So those cisternae, they're big holding tanks, and they are going to stockpile calcium ions in being ready for an actual muscle contraction. Now, again, because a lot of this is brand new and not something that you might have a ton of background with, kind of a visual that I can give you to think about with all of this is if you have a cake, you put icing over the top of the cake, that's essentially the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It is over the surface of the structures in the muscle cell. And then if you take candles and you stick candles in the cake, they're actually going to dive down into the cake itself. And that's what the transverse tubules do. They don't stay to the surface, they will actually dive down into the muscle tissue. So their location of where they go is a little bit different. Sarcoplasmic reticulum stays to the surface. Transverse tubules are going to dive down into the cell itself. There are 3 tubes that we have between the cisternae and the transverse tubule. So a cisternae on either side, transverse tubule in between the two. So when we talk about all of them together, we refer to them as the triad, tri indicating the 3 tubes. Myofibril, we had talked about those in our last, that is a bundle of those actin and myosin. And then the sarcomere. Sarcomere is really going to be a big part of our discussion that we have next time. So a sarcomere is the smallest unit, working unit that we have within the muscle tissue. So if you talk about anything in science, you have the smallest functioning unit. Chemistry, we have the atom. Biology, we have the cell. And when we get to muscles, we have the sarcomere. And again, big part of our focus next time. Now, I know that's a lot of new information, but just getting those terms out there, that is the biggest thing in you guys being able to hear them, being able to see them, especially being able to see them in color. I think that helps to be able to kind of differentiate between the different structures. So this is part 1 of our conversation. We will pick up part 2 next week and actually talk about what has to happen for a muscle to be able to contract.